where the monitors were and the rings were, but it's in a really crude state of completion. Actually, eventually we found out there was a prototype floating around the net, which was dumped like by Chinese bootleggers in the early 90s, like before Sonic 2 actually released. And they passed that on like as a full game. It wasn't. It was a prototype somewhere between Sonic 1 and Sonic 2. And it does contain a Hidden Palace Zone. And the object layout is exactly the same. They didn't touch the stage after this point. It's really fascinating. So, I'd like to talk about this guy, because I mentioned the Sonic CD beta page a while ago, and I remember when this goober showed up. I remember the SSRG not having the Sonic CD beta page. And then this guy showed up and he started documenting this prototype. And I'm getting a bit ahead of myself, but he started developing this Sonic fan game, Retro Sonic, which you're seeing right here. This is a more polished version. It was released later on. The early versions were really crude physics. But it had potential. Like, it took elements from various games, combined with unique ideas, and it started making something unique. It was almost like a new Sonic game, which at the time was a bit desperate at the time, because it was like the late 90s, and the last good Sonic game was Sonic 3, which had been released in 1994, so there was a drought of good Sonic games. Eventually, Paxton actually did port this game to the Sega Dreamcast of all things, but we'll get to that. So, all good things must come to an end, and SSRG was mostly run by angsty teenagers, and then there was rival sites like Sonic Cult, and then they battled, and some people gave up, and the SSRG closed in 2003, and it was sad. The Sonic fan games acquired were the first ones to leave. They already had their own subdomains, so it was easy for them to cut their losses. The Sonic 2 beta page eventually morphed into Sonic Retro, which has since become a community which deals with both unused content in the games, analyzing the prototypes, and also producing ROM hacks, producing modifications to the original Sonic games. To add to the confusion, later on there was a second SSRG, which is not the same as the original SSRG in the sense that it is not an aggregate site anymore. It's just another set of forums where you can discuss like unused stuff in Sonic games and post your hacks and stuff like that. To give you an idea what like Sonic hacking was at the time, this is basically it. Like, you had these tiny modifications to the game which replaced like the character sprites with a different character, in this case like Metal Sonic. Some changed the level, the color palettes of the levels, so now the stage was purple. Yay. Level design was still the same, but this was basically all that we could do at the time. This was aided by tools such as Tile Layer Pro, which is a multi-purpose tool for editing tile-based graphics in video games, which was compatible with like NES, SNES, Mega Drive. So that was easy enough to edit Sonic sprites. But then enter this guy, and this guy, what he did was he created the first fully functional level editor, Sonnet, which was a level editor where you could change the graphics of the stage, you can change the layout, you can change the object positions, you could eventually make your own game. He was also working on his own Sonic fan game, which was called Sonic Project Metrics. And it too was interesting. He was coding this completely from scratch, like the original version was for DOS only. He was coding this in pure C, using very little in terms of libraries, so this was really impressive at the time with how accurate the physics were to the real Sonic games. Talking more about Sonnet. Sonnet was amazing at the time. Like, you could make your own levels, you could do anything, you could make your own game. Kudos to Stealth for originally trying to make this paid software. He priced it at $30. Reportedly, nobody paid the $30. Then he lowered it to $15. Some people bought it, and then he just gave and he made a freeware edition, as it says on the title bar. This was a really great program at the time, because originally you can only like edit stuff in Genesis save states and stuff. So this was the real first time where you could make your own Sonic game, make your own levels, like from start to finish. There were some limitations. There was poor support for objects, for instance. You can see there, you can see the rings, you can see the monitors. Everything else is just a question mark. The question mark is marking the position of the object, but it's not telling you what the object is. That's because someone had to go in there and add object definitions, like those three things at the bottom. Those are spikes. You have to tell them, okay, so make them look like spikes, like load the spike graphics and the spike colors and put the spikes on there. But nobody ever did. They stayed question marks until all eternity. The other limitation is you can't add more than it is initially there. So the way this program worked is that it hooked right into the ROM offsets where the data was stored. So you could edit that data, you could replace that data. You could not make that data bigger than it was originally because then it wouldn't fit within the original slot. So if you wanted to add another enemy to the stage, you had to delete something in return. So that was a bummer. And then there were these hacking guides at the time. This was a hacking guide made by Saxman, not Taxman. This is another guy, Damien Grove, which he explains how to add water to a level. This is really simple. You just copy and paste those 6 lines of incomprehensible, opaque hex codes into the end of the ROM. Then you replace those values with the water level and such you want, and it works. And it did work because I did this back in the early 90s, or late 90s, I mean, the early 2000s. And it did work. It did nothing to load the actual water sprites, like the water splashes and stuff, but the water did appear in Emerald Hill, so it worked. But like, what does this mean? Obviously, people knew something, and this wasn't really public knowledge at the time. So we were used to that kind of ROM hack, like just replace the character sprites, just change the palettes, maybe change the levels, maybe someone actually used Sonnet to make actually original levels, and then we're treated to something like this, this is Sonic 2, except you're playing as Knuckles, and this is the desert stage that is in the final game, and that's the gator enemy, and that's, yeah, the gator, and a snail. There's actually a snail enemy, yeah, and the HUD is different. There's like centiseconds and the perfect counter and such. And then he breaks open the monitor. And there's Sonic 3 music. So what the hell is going on here? This marked a new era in ROM hacking, which was the split disassembly. Now, what the hell is a split disassembly? So what is a disassembly? The disassembly is when you use a program like IDA Pro. Here's the wonderful DOS version. You use IDA Pro to take the contents of a ROM, and IDA analyzes the contents for you, and it rewrites you the original assembly code as it looked before it was compiled to data, right? So you get a perfect one-to-one match with the original code. If you compile this, you get a byte-perfect ROM. Of course, there's a problem. You don't get any of the labels. That was lost during the assembly process. So you might document that this is the routine that draws the sprites in a special stage, but unless you document the rest, like the RAM address and everything, this is completely illegible. So IDA does a bunch of the heavy lifting, but then you do have to go in and do a lot of the work for yourself. Once again, Stealth was at the forefront of this. He was one of the first people to take advantage of the split of the disassembly movement. So he made Sonnet 2, which was the second version of the Sonnet editor, which instead of using hard-coded ROM offsets, it actually used split files. So you actually took the ROM offset, which held the level layout, the graphics and such, you split it into individual files, and then Sonnet, you can just load them like a normal editor does. Like you open the files, you edit them, save them, then you recompile the ROM, and there you go. There's a new stage. So Stealth and a bunch of entrepreneuring ROM hackers like level designers, graphic designers, they got together and they started making this really big ROM hack like Sonic Megamix, which you're seeing right here. And another thing the Stealth was really important in doing was making a disassembly of Sonic and Knuckles, which he released in 2007. And this is, with the Sonic and Knuckles split disassembly, is the part where I come in, basically, into the picture. Sorry. Hi. So, Sonic 3 Complete. So what is Sonic 3 Complete? Sonic 3 Complete was a ROM hack made by a guy named Tiddles. And what the goal of Sonic 3 Complete is to put Sonic 3, Sonic & Knuckles, and Sonic 3 & Knuckles in the same package, because there are actually slight differences between all the versions. It has extensive customization options. For instance, here you're playing Sonic 3 with the Sonic 1 sprite set. Here's the Sonic sprite from Sonic 1. And then it also has music from the PC version. So there's lots of dots and doodles. You can change the options menu to select your own custom build of Sonic 3. There's also numerous bug fixes and graphical enhancements to the original game, which was the point where I came into the picture. I started submitting stuff into to the Sonic 3 Complete project. For instance, I created I added to the sprite set for Supersonic. Original Supersonic used most of regular Sonic sprites, just colored yellow. So I made the corresponding poses for Supersonic, a bit of a pixel artist. I also changed a bit of the color palettes. For instance, in this part, Carnival Night is supposed to be suffering a blackout, but when you go in the water, it's bright again, so you don't get get that feel. So I made a water palette for it. So stuff like that, a few additional icons and such. But eventually got to the point where the stuff I wanted to implement, the graphical tweaks I wanted to implement, required writing custom code. Because, like, simple question. Can you tell me why in Sonic 1 and Sonic 2, when you have no rings, the HUD blinks yellow? But in Sonic 3, when you have no rings, it blinks transparent. Does anyone know the answer? The answer is Knuckles sucks. It's because of Knuckles sucks. So let me explain. So there's this thing called the color palette, which is the colors that can be displayed on the screen at any given point. You have the player palette on the top, and you have the enemy palette on the bottom. So Sonic uses the top palette. Generally, stage objects, such as the HUD, use the bottom palette. And you can see that the yellow and red colors are in the same index. So all the HUD has to do is change which color palette it's using, so it changes colors. Okay, easy enough. When you get to Sonic 3, things get a little bit more complicated, because if you realize the red doesn't align with the yellow anymore. Now, why is that? That's very simple. Because when you play as Knuckles, the game takes Sonic's palette, it writes Sonic's 3 blue colors with Knuckles' red colors. Okay, fair enough, but what does that have to do with anything? Haha, but Knuckles appears in cutscenes during Sonic's playthrough. And when that happens, the game loads Knuckles' palette to the enemy palette. But when it does this, now it has a problem. It needs to continue displaying the HUD correctly, so the yellow has to stay in the same place. So something has to go, and for better or for worse, the programmers decided to throw Knuckles' socks under the bus, and Knuckles' socks become yellow during cutscenes. So yeah, just to edit the color palettes and stuff in Sonic 3, you really have to know what's happening behind the HUD and what are the reasons, what are the justifications that programmers had for doing these kind of things. Luckily, to getting to object editing or sprite editing, there's actually a surprising bit of help, which is there was a patent registered back in 1992, which doesn't actually concern sprites. It concerns some features of Sonic 2. But in describing the palette, they have to describe how the sprites work. And they actually talk about this here, which is the sprite status table. What is the sprite status table? Well, you have two things. You have a sprite attribute table, which is what the hardware actually uses to display the sprite on screen. And then you have the sprite status table. What is the sprite status table? It is a way to abstract the concept of the hardware to the programmer. So we don't, when I tried to get into Sonic hacking, I was really scared of learning out of the assembly, because how the hell do you place a sprite on screen? It must be really hard, like system calls and talking to the co-processors. No, everything is done for you. There's this sprite status table, which is a data structure, which is stored in RAM. There's a section of RAM called object RAM, where you store any and many of these sprite status tables, and each of them represents a sprite. And now you can set its X position, its Y position, what is the address for its mappings file, what is the address for its graphics, what palette is it using, which frame of its animation it's using, and then all you have to do is you have to call functions. This is an example of a Sonic 3 object. It's really daunting at first, but it's not really scary. It starts at the top, you have a move, then a jump option. That's a switch statement. It takes the routine, and then it does a switch jump based on the routine. If it's 0, it goes to init. If it's 2, it goes to main. So we go through init. We set all the base variables, like render flags and width pixels, which determines when the sprite gets cut off at the edges of the screen and stuff. And then the main loop is really simple. Just check whether Sonic still has a shield. If it doesn't, then go destroy it, which you call a function for that. Delete current sprite, easy, okay. And then if he still has a shield, set the X position to the right value, the same as Sonic, set the priority correctly, then load the shield's animation, call the function that animates the sprite, and call the function that draws the sprite, and that's everything. And this is object-oriented programming. Yuji Naka was a genius. He devised this system in 1991. It's really easy to just add stuff to the game. You can quite easily add stuff I added custom objects to the special stages, custom type of sphere, the green spheres. I completely made this object from scratch. It's a recreation of the Metal Sonic hologram from Sonic CD in Sonic 3. I looked at not a single line of the original code. I coded it completely from scratch because all I have to do is like, okay, so it has how many sprites? Okay, so move them around, like call the sign function to get the sign, so you get the X and Y coordinates for the little bird, and then the box is solid, so call the solid object function, and it was really much easier than I expected. So going back to the question I posed at the start of my presentation. So why would I reverse engineer? Well, the first thing is obvious, to build things, to make cool stuff. That's the reason I started contributing to Sonic 3 Complete. And after I stopped working on Sonic 3 Complete like, I had creative differences with the author, like he wanted to take in one direction. I started wanting to add like new characters and new modes to the game. It didn't feel like Sonic 3 Complete anymore, so I decided to branch off and make my own project. So I started Sonic 3 Unlocked, which is my own project. It is a hack where you can control two characters at the same time. And you can exchange which characters you're playing without exiting the game. Like, I can switch from Sonic to Knuckles, and then I can change which character I'm controlling. I'm controlling Knuckles, now I switch over the Tails. Yeah. Now I can switch over. Now I can, like, switch Knuckles, pick Knuckles with Tails. It's a bunch of fun. It's still really, it's a very early prototype. Okay, good call. Okay, panic. Oh God. It's okay. Maybe it's not okay. I think I just lost power. Can I connect the AC? Eu tava com o daquele cheio. Hi. So one of the reasons to reverse engineer, build cool stuff. So hacking is cool. It's cool to make your own stuff. So there's my own like personal satisfaction in building something cool that people might enjoy someday. Someday someone might come across my stuff like on YouTube or whatever, and like, this is pretty cool. I'm gonna download this. I'm gonna play it and have some fun. And that's cool to think about. Excuse me. Oh yeah. Hello. I'm not sure what's going on. Okay. No, not this one. This one. Okay. That's good. Here we go. Sorry. So build cool stuff. Another point of reverse engineering, to document things. It's really important to go into the game and figure out what's in there. Like, there's been a ton of discoveries, like stuff was planned, was left on the cutting room floor, but they did delete it from the cartridge. There was no need to make room in the cartridge. So they left it inside. For instance, you might not know that there's, in Sonic 3, the original Sonic 3, the first cartridge, there's this unused object which shows Eggman escaping towards the horizon, which is meant for the ending cutscene. And for one reason or another, they didn't end up using it. But it's really cool. It uses like software scaling to dynamically shrink the Eggman sprite. It's really cool. So to that effect, I started a blog. I made a blog which has the same name as the hack, as my ROM hack. It's Sonic 3 Unlocked, where I talk about like all kinds of things, like editing stuff, unused stuff in the game, like just how some tricks were accomplished using the hardware limitations at the time. Another thing I did recently was I made my own disassembly project, because if you recall, I said that Stealth made the Sonic and Knuckles disassembly back in 2009. Nobody actually disassembled the original Sonic 3 up until now. This past February, was the 25th anniversary of Sonic 3, And as kind of an homage to that, I released a full Sonic 3 disassembly. So you can get it from GitHub. You can compile your own Sonic 3 ROM, and you can look at what's inside. There's some surprising stuff there. For instance, like some bosses from Sonic and Knuckles are already there. Their mappings are already there. So it changed a bit of my perspective of how complete the game was when they decided to split it. Another reason to reverse engineer is to help others build things. So you remember Sonad, and it had the problem of the objects looking like question marks. Well, later on, there was a more advanced level editor made by this guy named Main Memory. He remade the same concept as Sonad, but in a modern programming language. He made the whole thing in C#. But it had the same problem, like the objects, there were no object definitions, so you went into a level and it's all question marks, and this is less than useful. It's less than useful. So one of the projects I did was I went into the editor and I painstakingly went through every object and I mapped out how the object is supposed to look, its different configurations, if it's horizontal or vertical, what the movement pattern is going to be. For instance, you can tell that that top platform is going to go down, going to go back up. The one at the bottom is going to fall directly into the spikes and it's not coming back, stuff like that. So that was fun. And to do that, I had to do something really interesting, which is I actually had to reverse engineer the original assembly code, had to read it, and then because Sound Level is written in C#, the way to write custom object definitions for it is to write C# code. So I had to translate the original assembly into, well, passable C#. And finally, I think a really inspiring reason to reverse engineer this stuff is to build a career. If you remember this goober from the start of the video, Taxman Christian Whitehead. Well, in 2009, Sega launched this blog post where they were asking for like feedback on what games they would like to see like on iOS and mobile platforms. And so Taxman went with the guerrilla marketing approach, and he posted this video to YouTube, and he sent it directly to Sega. So what you're seeing right here is a full remake of Sonic CD, originally from the Mega CD released in 1993, completely remade, running on Taxman's proprietary retro engine, which he started when he was working on his fan game, Retro Sonic. So he took this idea he had as a kid, this pet project, and he made it into a business. He pitched this idea to Sega, and in 2011, Sonic CD for iOS, Android, Steam on PC, PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 was released, and it has full widescreen, has pitch perfect 60 frames per second, option of American and Japanese soundtracks, and lots more like playable tales. And what's interesting about this is really a part that gets me. Within the game files, Taxman hid this picture. In this picture, this is the desert stage from earlier. It's slightly remade in the style of Sonic CD, a bit abstract with like lines and bars and stuff, but it's the same idea. He actually pitched this idea to Sega, like to add this as a lost level to the game, like Desert Dazzle Zone, excuse me. Sega refused this idea. They wanted to stay true to the original game. They wanted just a straightforward remake of the original. Let's not get too fancy. But still, the game got released, and it sold really well. And then Sega contacted Taxman to make remakes of Sonic 1 and Sonic 2. And then they released, and actually Taxman, for these ports, he actually contacted Stealth, the other guy that I was talking about, like the author of Sonad and Split Disassemblies and Sonic Megamix. And he brought in his expertise to add stuff like playable Knuckles to the game. Now you can play as Sonic, Tails, and Knuckles in Sonic 1. So with each subsequent release, they stepped up their ante. So Sega allowed them to add Tails and Knuckles to Sonic 1, okay? In Sonic 2, they allowed to add the missing Hidden Palace Zone back into the game. So they actually went into the prototype version of the game, and they took the level graphics, they made their own level layout, added new enemies, new objects, and they made a full-fledged stage, including a boss, which is really amazing. And so this was all going towards the inevitability, which was in 2015, if I'm not mistaken. This happened. Christian Whitehead and Self Studio Headcanon, along with Pagoda West, which was actually composed of several members of Sonic Megamix original level designers and graphic artists. They got together and they pitched a completely original Sonic game to Sega. And Sonic Mania ended up being released in 2017, I think, and it did extremely well, and it has been reviewed as the best Sonic game like since ever. So this to me is really inspiring. Like, you could take something as nerdy and like a dead-end project like editing a game from 1994, and you can take that idea and eventually you can make a living out of it. You can make a business out of it. And you can make a business doing what you love, and that's really inspiring. And eventually, the desert level is there. They actually managed to get the desert level in there. It's called Mirage Saloon. It's fully playable. And yeah, that's it. I'm so happy. Guys, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for coming to my talk. That's it. If you have any questions about what I was talking about, anything regarding like Mega Drive development or like, I don't know, whatever you can think of, like, throw me a question. Thank you. So, any takers? Okay, so yeah. So the question was, how do you get the games into your PC? So they come in cartridges, right? What do you do? Well, for a long time there has been these people who work on preserving software, preserving old video games. And what they do is they build devices specific for reading cartridges and dumping the contents into, like, I don't know, like a serial connection or USB connection, whatever. So yeah, there's a whole industry, a whole section of users whose dedication is to preserving old software, and that's basically how we got. That's how we got these. Like the prototype ROM of Sonic 2, which was released on the internet like in the early 90s. That's how it was obtained. Like Chinese bootleggers in the early 90s, in 1991 or 1992, they managed to somehow steal an EEP-ROM, like an electronic erasable programmable ROM, from like an exhibit or something. They got the board, and they had a device, and they dumped the contents of the cartridge to a file. They uploaded the file onto the internet, and then it spread like wildfire. And then you could find it like on ROM sets or whatever, labeled like Sonic 2 bad dump, because it didn't match the final version. And that's why it took like probably over like 5 years until someone realized that, hey, this isn't actually a bad dump. This is a full prototype build of the game. It has stuff that was removed from the final game. So this is really interesting. So yeah.
So you need to build your own device to make the ROM compatible.
Yeah, basically that's basically it. You build your own device. Like I'm actually not the biggest buff on the hardware side of things. So. But yeah, there's a whole group of users dedicated to that stuff for all consoles, all platforms. Yeah, thanks for the question. Anyone else? Sure.
You believe Michael Jackson did the soundtrack for Sonic 3? There's a rumor about that.
That's not a rumor. That's true. That's actually true. So what happened was, once Sega was developing Sonic 2. Michael Jackson actually came by to Sega to visit. He was a really big fan of Sonic, so he said, like, when you make the next game, I'd really like to make the soundtrack. And then when Sonic 3 rolled around, that actually came true. They actually went and contacted Jackson, and he, along with a bunch of his musicians, like Brad Buxer and Sirocco Jones, they actually started making a soundtrack. I can actually show you something really interesting. So it's easier to realize in the chorus, but this song is familiar to you, that's because this is the song for Ice Cap Zone in Sonic 3. So the Jetsons was actually a band that was produced by one of Jackson's chief musician, I think. I don't know. Brad Buxer. So Brad Buxer actually, this was an unreleased song on an unreleased album. So Brad Buxer actually went back and took the melody and used it as the song for Ice Cap Zone. And there's other anecdotal evidence. For instance, like the Sonic 3 credits music, Sonic 3 credits, is actually an early version of Stranger in Moscow. It's probably a mashup video song, Stranger in Moscow. So yeah, it's not a rumor. This is actually true. And what's rumored to have happened is when they were developing Sonic 3, the scandal broke out of Michael Jackson's, their accusations against Michael Jackson. You know what I'm talking about. So Sega decided to cut their losses and remove Michael Jackson from the credits. But the soundtrack remains. So the songs are there. And what's telling is that in Sonic and Knuckles, they actually brought a new musician, Howard Drossen, to rewrite some of the songs, which were probably original Jackson compositions that he wanted to get rid of. Yeah. So, any more questions?
I wanted to add another question.
Sure.
Less related to music. How much of the code is shared between different games, and like how much of the changes actually apply to other games?
Between different Sonic games.
Yeah, not necessarily Sonic games, but...
Well, I am most familiar with Sonic games, yeah, so I'm going to answer that in the perspective of the Sonic games. Sonic 2 is completely an evolution of Sonic 1 in every way. Like, it is the same code base with added stuff on top of it. And Sonic 3 is Sonic 2 with added stuff on top of it. With each new game, it was basically a new revision of the game engine, in which they added new features which they needed to implement certain things into the game. Like, for instance, in Sonic 3 has like seamless transitions between levels. You complete Act 1 and you go straight into Act 2. That required the graphics to decompress really fast. So they developed a new compression algorithm that lets stuff decompress really fast. That kind of stuff. Yeah. More questions?
Hi. So retro gaming is now a big trend. For instance, on the Switch now we have a new Sonic game, which is part the old levels and part the new levels.
Sonic Mania, exactly.
Sonic Mania, really complicated stuff. I dropped out after the second level. And also they released a big pack also on the Switch of a lot of Sega games. My question is, have you, and knowing that is a homebrew and the user base of the Switch is higher than for these kind of mods, have you looked into disassembling the Switch games, checking out the differences, both the big collection, which is supposed to be an emulator with the ROMs on it, and the actual Sonic Mania, and check the differences?
So the collection that's on Switch, and it's also on other platforms like Steam, PC, PlayStation, Xbox, I think, that is emulated. That is an emulator running the original games. So the ROM files are there verbatim. The emulator is not particularly good. It is not very accurate. It has really bad latency problems on the Switch, actually. I actually bought that. It was on sale. You press a jump button, and then like a quarter second later, Sonic jumps, which is really, really detrimental to such a fast-paced game. So in that respect, there's no mystery there. It's the original Mega Drive game, like pure. Sonic Mania. Sonic Mania is more complicated. It is a different beast. Like I said, it is built on the Retro engine, originally made by Taxman. So it is completely, it is the same algorithms, but completely rewritten in new languages, proprietary scripting languages. So while I expect that the same spirit and same ideas are there, the code is likely to be quite different because they didn't have to follow the approaches that the original Mega Drive programs were forced to do. There is no disassembly of Sonic Mania, to my knowledge. I believe that the authors of like the Sonic Mania mod loader that exists for the PC, where you can load your own mods onto Sonic Mania, it's amazing. They make levels, characters, music, graphics. It's a whole nother thing. So what that does, it hooks into certain function calls within the Sonic Mania executable and inject new stuff, new data, new levels, etc. So to that extent, Sonic Mania has been disassembled in order to find those function hooks, but a full disassembly does not exist for the game so far. Also, all the data is stored in a proprietary format like Retrosonic Software Development Kit format or whatever. It's encrypted and stuff, so it's harder. It's harder in the Mega Drive because on Mega Drive they basically counted on the difficulty of duplicating cartridges as piracy protection. They don't have really any there's no code to prevent you from running a pirated version of the game. You have the game, you have the game, yeah. More questions? All right, I think that's it then. Thank you so much.